For 10 long years, Chris Doumitt worked beside Parker Schnabel through freezing nights, heavy storms, and long days of endless digging. He was the kind of man who never complained, never asked for credit, and never missed a shift. He was there when the gold came out of the ground and when the mud swallowed the machines. He was there when the pay was good and when the season went bad. To Parker, Chris was more than a crew member. He was family. But one morning, everything changed. There was no argument, no warning, and no farewell. The sun rose over Scribner Creek, and Chris's trailer spot was empty. His coffee mug still sat on the table, half full. His name, once painted proudly on the side of his dozer, had been wiped clean. The rest of the crew whispered quietly, unsure what had happened. Some thought maybe he'd gone home for a break. Others said maybe Parker had reassigned him. But as the hours passed and his radio stayed silent, everyone knew something was different this time. When Parker finally got word, Chris was already gone. He didn't leave a message or a note, just disappeared. When reporters later asked Parker about it, he only said 5 quiet words that made people wonder for months. "He's got his reasons," Parker said. And that was all. Those words spread through every camp in the Yukon. People started guessing, inventing stories and building rumors out of silence. Some said Chris had finally decided to strike out on his own. Others whispered that he'd found something he didn't want the cameras to see. But the truth was stranger than any rumor. Because just a few weeks later, a small satellite company released new images of the Yukon. Hidden deep in the northern wilderness, far from any known claim, there was a small active mining site. One man, one truck, one wash plant running smoke into the frozen air. When people zoomed in, the silhouette was unmistakable. It was Chris Doumitt. Locals who flew supply planes through that area confirmed it. They said Chris had set up a one-man operation in a place called Cedar Ridge, a steep, forested slope that hadn't been mined in nearly 100 years. There was no crew, no investors, and no camera team. Just Chris, his old pickup, a modified wash plant, and a dream he'd never spoken aloud. What surprised everyone even more was how he'd gotten the land. The claim wasn't registered through any modern mining office. It had been transferred quietly through an old company that no longer existed, a name that hadn't appeared in decades. Cedar Mining Company, 1931. When a few curious people dug into the records, they found something strange. The company had folded after a cave-in in the late 1930s. The area had been written off as unstable and forgotten. But Chris knew something nobody else did. Months earlier, in a small storage unit near Fairbanks, he had found an old notebook wrapped in oilcloth. It belonged to his grandfather, H. Doumitt, 1937. The pages were worn and stained, filled with hand-drawn maps, short notes, and coordinates. And across several pages, one phrase was repeated again and again, written in thick, dark pencil: vault line, too rich to haul. For most people, that would have been a curious family relic, a piece of mining history from the past. But for Chris, it was a message. He realized his grandfather had once worked at Cedar Ridge, long before modern equipment, long before television mining. And according to that notebook, the miners of 1937 had found a pocket of gold so pure that their crude wash plants couldn't even process it. They sealed the shaft, marked the spot on a private map, and left it buried when the company went bankrupt. To others, it was just a legend. To Chris, it was unfinished business. One cold morning, without telling anyone, he packed his gear into his truck, folded the notebook into a canvas bag, and started driving north. He didn't call Parker. He didn't call home. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was chasing a ghost, his grandfather's voice echoing through time.
When he reached Cedar Ridge, the landscape looked just as the notebook described. Black clay under glacial till, a narrow run of gravel sparkling faintly under sunlight. He set up a small camp, started the pump, and fired up his old wash plant. The first load looked lifeless, just gray dirt and cold rock. But when he panned the final tray in the sunlight, the rim flared gold. It wasn't dust. It wasn't flakes. It was chunky, coarse gold, heavy and bright, exactly as the notebook had said. Chris smiled for the first time in weeks. "You did it, old man," he whispered. By the end of 2 days, he had cleaned out more than 100 ounces, more than some full crews found in a week. He stacked the jars in his truck bed and stared at
Them in silence. It wasn't about the money. It was about the proof. Proof that his grandfather hadn't been chasing a myth. Proof that he had been right all along. But the ridge wasn't finished with him. Late that night, while scraping another cut of pay dirt, the bucket of his excavator hit something hard. Not rock, not ice, but wood. A hollow, deep thud. He stopped the machine, climbed down, and started digging by hand. What he uncovered was a wooden crate buried under layers of frozen gravel. The boards were black with rot, bound by rusty iron straps. He pried it open carefully, expecting it to crumble. Inside was a pile of relics from another time, old drill bits, a revolver, and, wrapped in oiled cloth, a small tin box. Inside that box was a folded map. The ink was faded, but still readable. It showed Cedar Ridge as it was, 3 tunnels drawn deep beneath the slope, each labeled in the same handwriting from his grandfather's notebook, Vault Line. In the margins, one note stood out. Too rich to haul, leave for the next Doumitt. Chris sat beside the open crate, the wind whistling through the pit. It wasn't just a map. It was a message, passed through blood. His grandfather hadn't failed here. He had hidden something. He understood then that the gold he'd already found was only the surface. The real treasure lay deep underground, sealed away in those shafts since 1937. The next morning, his radio came alive for the first time in weeks. A voice crackled through, an old friend from Dawson. "You've got a problem, Chris," the man said. "Someone leaked coordinates from a geoscan. Where it is, your claim's off the charts." Chris didn't reply. He didn't need to. Within days, trucks and drones began appearing on nearby ridges. Rival prospectors tried to buy up the surrounding land. They didn't know what he had, but they knew it was big. Then came the call he wasn't expecting. It was Parker. The first time they'd spoken since Chris left. "You're working the ridge, aren't you?" Parker asked quietly. Chris didn't answer. "My granddad's logs mentioned that place. Said it caved in on a crew in the 30s. It's not right ground, Chris. It's cursed ground." Chris looked across the pit at the dark trees, the mist curling over the dirt. He knew Parker might be right, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. "Then I'll dig where they stopped," he said. The line went dead. From that day, Cedar Ridge became more than a hidden claim. It became a battle between time, blood, and gold. Helicopters circled in the distance. Companies sent scouts. But Chris didn't flinch. Every night he studied the old map, tracing the lines with a dusty finger, memorizing every mark and every warning. He wasn't just mining. He was listening. To the ground, to the past, to his grandfather's unfinished story. The Yukon had seen many miners, many fortunes rise and fall, but none like this. Because Chris wasn't digging for money anymore. He was digging for legacy. And deep below the frozen ridge, the mountain waited. For several days after that phone call, the ridge stayed quiet. The snow thickened, the wind picked up, and the night temperatures dropped below freezing.
The machines groaned in the cold, their metal frames whining with every turn. Chris worked alone, his gloves stiff with frost, his breath fogging in the morning air. He didn't talk much, even to himself. He just listened to the sounds of the gravel, to the hum of the pump, to the rhythm of the shovel striking earth. He was digging deeper into the same spot where his excavator had hit that old crate. The ground there was strange. The soil layers didn't match the rest of the pit. It was darker, denser, almost oily. When he pushed the bucket down another few feet, the ground started to shake. At first he thought it was just the machine vibrating, but then the earth began to sink. A hollow space opened up beneath him, and before he could react, the corner of the pit gave way. The excavator tilted slightly. Chris jumped out just in time, rolling across the frozen dirt as a small section of the wall collapsed. When the dust settled, he looked down into the hole, and what he saw made his heart stop. Below him, carved out of the rock and timbered with old beams, was the mouth of a tunnel. The air rising from it was warm and stale, smelling of rust and age. It was one of the shafts from the map. He climbed down carefully, using a rope to steady himself. The beams were black and splintered, but still standing. He switched on his headlamp and took a slow breath. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and steep, with old rail tracks buried in mud. He could hear faint drops of water echoing in the distance. Each step he took stirred up clouds of dust that hadn't moved in almost a century. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became. The walls sparkled faint under his light, thin veins of quartz glittering like frost. And then he saw it, a small wooden sign nailed to one of the beams, the writing barely visible. But when he wiped away the dirt, the words appeared, Vault Line. He froze for a moment, staring at it. This was it, the place his grandfather had marked, the place too rich to haul. He set up a small tripod light, started clearing debris, and began to dig again. Every few inches, flakes of gold appeared in the dirt, thick, heavy, yellow. It wasn't ordinary pay, it was laced through the gravel like threads of sunlight. By the end of that first night, his pan was overflowing. He poured the contents into a metal jar, watching the gold settle to the bottom. Then he sat down beside the tunnel wall, exhausted and trembling. You found it. You really found it. But his joy was mixed with unease. The air inside the tunnel was too warm for winter, and every few minutes the ground rumbled faintly, as if something deep inside was breathing. He knew these old shafts could collapse without warning, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. When he climbed back out the next morning, the sky was clear. Frost glittered on the ridge. In the distance, he saw tracks, fresh tire marks on the snow that weren't his. Someone had been there. He followed them a short way and found what he feared. A drone, half buried near the trees, its lights still blinking. Someone had been scouting his site. He picked it up, removed the battery, and crushed it under his boot. That evening he worked faster. The tunnel was rich beyond belief. For every bucket of dirt, he was getting ounces of gold, not flakes, solid, rough nuggets the size of his thumb. He kept loading, washing, and panning until his hands ached. He filled jar after jar, stacking them carefully in a wooden crate. By the third day, he had pulled out nearly 75 pounds of gold. At modern prices, that was close to $75 million. But more than the gold, what he found next changed everything. Deeper inside the shaft, beyond a collapsed timber, he uncovered a narrow passage sealed with stone. The map had shown this spot, but left it unmarked. He used a crowbar to break through. Behind the wall was a small chamber just tall enough to stand in. Inside, resting on a wooden table covered in dust, was a leather-bound book and a metal lantern that hadn't burned in nearly 100 years.
Bound book and a metal lantern that hadn't burned in nearly 100 years. He opened the book slowly. The first page was dated 1937. The handwriting was neat, steady, and signed H. Doumitt. The journal described the last days of the Cedar Mining Company, the cave-ins, the arguments, and the decision to seal the tunnel. But what struck Chris most was the final entry. It read, "The line runs deeper than we can follow. We leave it not from fear, but from faith. The gold is not ours to take. Someday, one of my own will finish what I began. May he do so with clean hands and a steady heart." Chris closed the book slowly, his hands trembling. His grandfather hadn't just been mining, he had been protecting something, leaving behind a message of purpose, not greed. Outside, the wind howled through the valley. He packed the journal carefully, loaded his truck, and sat behind the wheel. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a miner chasing pay dirt. He felt like a man standing on sacred ground. But the world outside wasn't as quiet. Word of the Cedar Ridge gold had spread faster than he imagined. Within days, helicopters began circling the area. Survey teams arrived, pretending to be environmental inspectors. And then, one evening, a black SUV rolled up the frozen trail. Two men stepped out, wearing parkas with no logos, their boots spotless. "Mr. Doumitt," one of them said, "we'd like to talk about your claim." Chris didn't invite them in. He just stood there, silent. The taller man smiled. "We represent an interested group. They're willing to buy your rights to this site. Whatever figure you have in mind, we'll meet it. In cash." Chris shook his head. "This claim isn't for sale," he said. "Think carefully," the man replied. "You're alone out here. The ridge isn't safe. You could lose everything in a cave-in, or worse." Chris looked him straight in the eye. "I already lost everything that matters," he said quietly. "All that's left is this." The men exchanged glances, then turned and walked back to their vehicle. The SUV disappeared into the snow. That night, Chris didn't sleep. He knew the ridge was no longer a secret. He packed some of the gold into sealed containers, buried them near the tree line, and hid the rest inside a reinforced crate under the floor of his cabin. He kept only a small jar on the table, enough to remind him of why he was there. Days turned into weeks. He repaired his equipment, reinforced the tunnel entrance, and kept digging. The deeper he went, the more gold he found, but the more dangerous it became.
That time was running out. One afternoon, while checking the pump by the creek, he heard the unmistakable sound of engines, several of them. He ran to the ridge edge and saw 3 trucks climbing the slope. He didn't know who they were, but he knew they weren't miners. He hurried back to his cabin, grabbed the notebook and journal, and loaded them into his truck. Then, as the first truck appeared through the trees, he started the engine. The tires spun in the snow before gripping, and he tore down the narrow trail, the roar of engines behind him. For 2 hours, he drove through frozen streams and broken paths until the forest opened up to a clearing. He stopped there, catching his breath. The sun was setting, and the light hit the hills in a blaze of orange. He took out the journal one last time and looked at the last line again. May he do so with clean hands and a steady heart. He knew what he had to do. He drove to an old ranger station near Dawson and left a sealed box at the front door. Inside was the map, the notebook, and the journal. On top of it, he placed a note that said, "For the one who still listens." Then he got back into his truck and disappeared into the Yukon night. No one knows where he went after that. Some say he returned to Oregon. Others believe he stayed in the north, guarding what was left of Cedar Ridge. Months later, when a small crew revisited the site, they found the cabin empty. The machines were gone. The tunnel had collapsed completely. But near the entrance, someone had carved a single word into the rock. Finished. And in the ashes of the fire pit, they found a small sealed jar of gold, untouched. Months passed. Winter settled heavy across the Yukon, locking every stream and trail under thick sheets of ice. The world forgot about Cedar Ridge. Most people thought it was just another story told around campfires, another rumor in a land full of rumors. But stories have a way of finding their own path. When spring came, a young park ranger doing a routine patrol near Dawson spotted a strange wooden box sitting beside the door of an old ranger station. The label had almost faded, the paper yellow from the cold. He picked it up and noticed the handwriting. For the one who still listens.
One who still listens. Inside, he found the leather notebook, the old mining map, and a journal written in careful letters signed H. Doumitt. The ranger didn't understand what he was looking at, but the words Cedar Ridge caught his eye. He remembered hearing old miners in town whisper about a man who had gone missing there. The name stuck with him. He turned the box in to the local office, and within a week it reached the Territorial Mining Archives in Whitehorse. That's where everything changed. The archivist who opened the box realized what she was holding. The map matched a lost claim file from 1931, a site thought to have been destroyed by landslides. The journal proved that a second Doumitt had returned decades later, but there was no record of him leaving. When the news reached Parker, he didn't believe it at first. He had moved on with the next season, running new ground and new crew, but the name Doumitt was still written on one of his old bulldozers. When he saw the photograph of the journal, he recognized the handwriting on a note attached to it. It was Chris's. He flew north that same week. At the ranger station, they showed him everything: the notebook, the map, the letter from 1937, and the journal entries from Chris himself, short and simple, ending with one final line written in a shaky hand. The ridge kept its promise. Parker didn't speak for a long time. He just stood by the window, staring out at the frozen trees. He finally said, "He found it, didn't he?" The archivist nodded. Whatever it was, he found it. Later, when Parker reached the ridge by helicopter, he walked among the ruins of the cabin. The snow had melted, revealing twisted metal and pieces of wood. He found the word "finished" carved into the rock. He traced it with his glove, feeling the grooves cut deep into the stone. For the first time, he understood why Chris had left without saying goodbye. It wasn't about gold. It was about something older, deeper, a promise carried through generations. He camped there for a night, lighting a small fire just as Chris must have done countless times. The flames flickered against the rocks, throwing long shadows across the frozen ground. He took a small nugget from his pocket, one that Chris had given him years before, and placed it beside the fire.
"Rest easy, old friend," he said quietly. The next morning, Parker flew back to camp, but the story of Cedar Ridge had already begun to spread again. Pilots talked about it over radio. Local miners claimed to have seen lights in the valley at night, as if someone were still working down there. Some said the ridge itself glowed faintly when the moon was full, as if the gold beneath the ground still caught the light. People started calling it Doumitt's Line. The legend grew with every telling. Some said he'd hidden hundreds of pounds of gold somewhere deep in the ridge. Others believed he had sealed the main vein forever, choosing to leave it untouched. A few even thought he was still alive, wandering from camp to camp under a different name, keeping watch over the hills. But for those who knew him best, the truth was simpler. Chris had done what every miner dreams of. He had found meaning in the dirt. He had turned the chase for gold into a journey of faith and memory. Parker kept the old map locked in a weatherproof case at his camp. Sometimes, when the long nights of mining dragged on and morale ran low, he'd unfold it and point to the small hand-drawn line marked Vault.